The spring of 1940 witnessed a revolutionary and terrifying new form of warfare. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, shattered all prior military expectations. Its core principles relied upon swift, coordinated movements by armored divisions supported by air power. This strategy was designed to bypass static defenses and plunge deep into enemy rear areas. France and the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, were completely unprepared for this unprecedented speed. The German tanks, primarily the Panzer I, II, III, and IV, seemed to possess an unstoppable, psychological advantage. These panzer crews moved with a confidence bordering on arrogance, knowing their enemies were reeling from shock. Their armored spearheads carved deep chasms into the Allied defenses almost at will. The speed of the advance created an overwhelming feeling of helplessness among the Allied troops. News of German tanks appearing suddenly miles behind the main battle line spread fear like wildfire. The Panzers were lightly armored by later war standards but perfectly suited for the breakthrough tactics of 1940. Their commanders, like Rommel, pushed relentlessly forward, often outpacing their own infantry support. This dynamic, aggressive style of command was proving immediately and devastatingly successful. Allied attempts to form coherent new defensive lines repeatedly failed under the pressure. The entire campaign rapidly devolved into a race to the sea for the beleaguered BEF. The initial German successes bred a dangerous overconfidence within the Wehrmacht's armored corps. They believed no Allied tank yet deployed could genuinely slow down their triumphant march. This hubris would be tested severely in the fields outside the town of Arras. The BEF was perilously close to being cut off and annihilated near the Belgian border. A critical, desperate counterattack was the only remaining viable option for the British leadership. The Allied forces needed to strike a sharp, unexpected blow to restore any semblance of a fighting chance. It was a moment in history where conventional wisdom was about to be turned upside down. The Panzers were soon to encounter a kind of tank they had never truly faced before. The British deployed two distinct classes of tanks at the start of the war: cruiser tanks and infantry tanks. The cruiser tank was designed for speed and exploitation, much like the German Panzers. The infantry tank, however, was built on a totally different, almost contradictory, tactical doctrine. These tanks were expected to move at a slow, deliberate pace, supporting foot soldiers. Their primary role was to defeat enemy anti-tank defenses and clear the way for the infantry advance. The Matilda II, specifically the Mark II, represented the pinnacle of this infantry tank concept in 1940. It was a true fortress on tracks, sacrificing speed for an unprecedented level of protection. Its armor thickness ranged up to 80 mm, especially on the critical front-facing plates. This was a remarkable figure for the time, easily outclassing any contemporary German tank design. The earliest German Panzer III and IV models possessed front armor that was significantly thinner. The sheer weight of the Matilda II contributed to its slow top speed, barely exceeding 15 miles per hour. Its heavy armor was composed of riveted steel sections, creating a robust, almost impenetrable shell. The tank's main armament was a relatively small 2-pounder gun, effective against other tanks but lacking high explosive power. This gun was a limiting factor, but its primary purpose was anti-tank defense, which it performed adequately. The Germans, focusing on swift maneuvering, had dismissed the slow-moving, heavily protected design as obsolete. They viewed the Matilda as a relic of trench warfare, too ponderous for the mobile battlefield. The contrast between the two nations' tank philosophies could not have been starker. Britain favored protection, while Germany prioritized mobility and integrated communications. The Matilda's thick hide was essentially a perfect defense against the standard German anti-tank weaponry. The standard 37mm German Pak-36 anti-tank gun was known as the door knocker. This diminutive weapon was effective against lighter Allied tanks but harmlessly struck the Matilda's hull. The British crews were fully aware of their tank's limitations but also of its unique strength. They were about to unleash this mobile iron fortress onto a foe who believed they held all the advantages. The design represented a defiant challenge to the German doctrine of overwhelming speed. German armored forces held the British tank designs in considerable disdain during the initial fighting. The lighter British cruiser tanks often suffered from mechanical breakdowns and inadequate armor protection. They were fast, but their lack of staying power in a prolonged engagement was evident to the Germans. The Panzer crews, having faced the French tanks and some early Matildas, felt utterly superior. They often referred to the initial Matilda I as a small, clumsy joke with its machine gun armament. The Matilda II was visually similar, but its upgraded armor was initially underestimated by the Germans. This underestimation stemmed from the overwhelming and rapid nature of their own victories. Confidence became a blinding factor, preventing a proper tactical assessment of enemy capabilities. The belief that the Blitzkrieg had made heavy, slow armor irrelevant was widespread among the tank commanders. They saw their own superior mobility and firepower as the ultimate answer to any challenge. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, in particular, had swept aside resistance with remarkable ease. This division was considered one of the sharpest spearheads of the entire German invasion force. Its crews were battle-hardened and utterly convinced of their invincibility against the demoralized Allies. The German army's communications system, allowing for flexible command, further increased their arrogance. They could coordinate quickly and shift fire, while Allied tank doctrine was often more rigid and centralized. The sheer technological disparity seemed to favor the Germans in almost every encounter. The Panzer crews, therefore, had every reason to be confident in their initial assessment of the battle. They saw their opponents as disorganized, poorly led, and equipped with outmoded equipment. The British decision to deploy the Matildas at Arras was a desperate gamble against this prevailing mindset. It was a deliberate attempt to shock the German war machine out of its confident stride. The German intelligence apparatus had failed to fully appreciate the defensive power of the Matilda II. This intelligence failure would have immediate and catastrophic consequences for their frontline troops. Their laughter and initial scorn would quickly turn into shock and then desperate panic. The coming engagement would teach the Panzer crews a brutal lesson about armor protection. The situation for the Allied forces in mid-May 1940 was deteriorating rapidly and beyond measure. The German plan, Manstein's audacious sickle cut through the Ardennes, had succeeded perfectly. Panzer Division sliced through the weak center of the Allied line, reaching the coast at Abbeville. This decisive maneuver effectively trapped the majority of the French First Army and the entire BEF. The Allied armies were now compressed into a rapidly shrinking pocket in northern France and Belgium. The port of Dunkirk and its surrounding beaches suddenly became the focus of all strategic thought. Every single day lost meant thousands more soldiers would be captured or killed on the beaches. The BEF's high command recognized the critical need for a major diversionary attack. This attack would have to be strong enough to force the Germans to pause and divert forces. If the German drive on the coast could be momentarily halted, it would buy precious time for an evacuation. The French were also desperately planning a counterattack from the south to break the encirclement. The planned operation around the town of Arras was not intended as a strategic breakthrough itself. Its main goal was simply to relieve the pressure on the encircled Allied forces to the north. The pressure exerted by the relentless German advance was proving unbearable for the BEF. The political situation in London was equally strained, demanding some kind of successful military action. A complete collapse of the BEF would have been a national disaster and an irreparable loss of material. The British and French high commands were scrambling to coordinate any joint effort possible. Logistics were breaking down, and communication between units was becoming increasingly fragmented. The entire campaign was turning into a desperate struggle for survival and extraction. The small counterattack at Arras suddenly carried a strategic importance far beyond its size. It was the final roll of the dice to create a temporary, essential window for escape. The hope was that a sharp blow could create momentary confusion in the confident German ranks. The outcome of this local engagement would directly influence the success of the Dunkirk evacuation. The counterattack near Arras was hurriedly conceived and organized amidst the pervasive chaos. It was named Operation Frankforce, a code name reflecting the limited nature of the available units. The force was primarily composed of 2 British infantry tank battalions, the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments. These regiments were equipped with approximately 60 Matilda tanks, a mix of Mki and the heavier Mk2. They were supported by the 150th and 151st Infantry Brigades, adding essential foot soldiers to the push. The attack was intended to strike southward, right into the flank of General Rommel's advancing 7th Panzer Division. The British intelligence estimated the German forces to be less organized than they truly were. The objective was to smash through the German supply lines and cause a significant tactical disarray. This daring plan was inherently risky due to the overstretched and tired condition of the British troops. Many of the units had already endured days of constant movement and defensive fighting. The terrain around Arras was relatively open but offered some crucial areas for concealment. The coordination with the French forces, which were supposed to attack from a different direction, was shaky. Operational security was minimal, and the entire endeavor was a race against time and exhaustion. The British commanders knew the odds were heavily stacked against their small force. However, the necessity of the mission outweighed the considerable risks involved in its execution. This counterstroke represented the only active effort to challenge the German flank at that moment. The plan was a desperate attempt to show the Germans that the BEF still possessed fighting spirit. It aimed to disrupt the relentless tempo of the German advance, which was their most potent weapon. The element of surprise was the most critical factor upon which the entire operation depended. If the Panzers saw the attack coming, their superior numbers and tactical flexibility would crush it instantly. The infantry tanks were expected to act as a battering ram, capitalizing on their thick armor. The hopes of thousands of trapped Allied soldiers were now resting on these few dozen tanks. The attack was scheduled for the late afternoon of May 21, 1940, at the height of the crisis. The British counterattack launched in the afternoon of May 21, achieving a significant degree of surprise. The Matilda tanks, rumbling forward slowly but relentlessly, first encountered German infantry. The advancing British forces quickly overwhelmed the forward German reconnaissance and security elements. These German infantry units were lightly equipped and possessed only the standard anti-tank rifles. The rifles, designed for lighter armor, had no effect whatsoever on the thick hide of the Matilda II. The German soldiers watched in disbelief as the slow-moving tank simply rolled over their positions. This initial shock registered immediately with the German divisional command. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had been moving forward aggressively, confident that its flanks were secure. They were completely unprepared for an armored counterpunch of this unexpected severity. The sound of the battle quickly escalated, forcing Rommel to personally assess the unfolding disaster. The speed of the British breakthrough was ironically due to the tank's thick armor, not its pace. The Matilda II was essentially immune to all small arms fire and standard light anti-tank weapons. German artillery observers began reporting monsters or landships that could not be stopped. The confusion in the German ranks was palpable as communication channels became jammed with panicked reports. The British achieved penetration to a depth of several miles, causing significant damage and casualties. Supply convoys and rear echelon troops suddenly found themselves under heavy enemy fire. This unforeseen attack threatened to unravel the cohesive forward movement of the entire German division. The initial contempt for the British armor evaporated instantly and was replaced by genuine alarm. Rommel immediately began diverting his own tank and artillery units to confront the unexpected threat. The psychological impact of the attack was arguably more significant than its tactical gains. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and demonstrated that the Allies could still fight back. The battlefield around Arras was transformed from a steady German advance into a sudden, chaotic melee. The sheer destructive power of a surprise armored attack was suddenly felt by the German command. The main clash occurred when the Matildas finally met the German Panzer battalions head-on. The German tanks, primarily Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, opened fire confidently with their main guns. Their 50mm and short-barreled 75mm shells slammed into the Matilda's front plate. The Panzer crews watched in horror as their rounds either harmlessly bounced off or simply shattered. The thick, sloped armor of the British tanks rendered the standard German tank guns completely ineffective. It was an utterly unprecedented and psychologically damaging experience for the German crews. They had been taught to believe their firepower was superior to anything the Allies possessed. The Matildas continued their slow, steady advance, seemingly unfazed by the barrage of incoming fire. The British 2-pounder guns, while small, were still able to penetrate the thinner armor of the Panzer II. Several German tanks were quickly knocked out of action by the accurate, if not high-explosive, fire. The battlefield became littered with the wreckage of burning German vehicles. Panzer crews began frantically trying different angles and distances, but the result was always the same. The sound of shell fragments violently deflecting off the armor was a terrifying sound for the Germans. It created a sense of utter futility, as their weapons were proving useless against this specific enemy. This unexpected armor superiority fundamentally changed the dynamic of the tank-on-tank fight. The German crews found themselves in the terrifying position of being the hunted, not the hunters. They realized that the only way to stop the Matildas was through flanking maneuvers or specialized heavy weapons. The British tanks were suddenly transformed in the German consciousness from a joke to a serious threat. The engagement became a brutal confirmation that the German tank designs had a critical vulnerability. This realization would directly influence future German tank development throughout the war. The Matilda had, for a brief time, become the most heavily armored tank in the entire theater. The German anti-tank defenses, the Panzerjäger units, were thrown into the desperate fray. These units primarily relied on the 37mm Pak-36, a highly mobile but light weapon. The gun crews were brave, often holding their ground until the very last moment to get a clear shot. Their efforts were tragically ineffective against the massive protection of the Matilda II. The crews watched their rounds hit the British tanks, only to make a dull thud and fail to penetrate. This humiliating reality earned the Pak-36 the moniker Heeresschreck, or Army Scourge, for its uselessness. The only hope for these anti-tank crews was to aim for the tank's tracks or the vision ports. Even these difficult shots often failed to stop the determined progress of the British tanks. Frustration quickly turned into a genuine panic among the frontline anti-tank gunners. They were forced to abandon their weapons and retreat as the slow-moving tanks rolled towards them. The German commanders desperately began calling for heavier, towed artillery pieces to be brought forward. The famous German 88mm anti-aircraft gun, the Flak-36, was the only viable solution. This large-caliber gun had not been designed for anti-tank work, but its high-velocity shells were powerful. It was a slow process to get these massive guns moved from their anti-aircraft positions into the front line. Until the 88 arrived, the German forces had no reliable way to stop the Matilda's advance. The entire defensive structure of the 7th Panzer Division was suddenly revealed as dangerously fragile. The inability to stop a small group of tanks exposed a massive operational flaw in German doctrine. The British tanks were forcing the Germans to rely on improvised and secondary weapons. The fight near Arras demonstrated the immediate need for a significant upgrade in German anti-tank weaponry. The German field manual was effectively rewritten in the span of a few terrifying hours. The sheer scale of this defensive crisis was a profound shock to the Wehrmacht leadership. It highlighted the difference between the tank as a breakthrough weapon and as a true armored fortress. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, found himself directly in the path of the attack. He was caught completely by surprise, having been personally focused on the forward thrust of his division. The attack hit his exposed flank and threatened to cut off his own headquarters and supply column. Rommel later documented his shock and alarm at the unexpected power of the British tanks. He recalled the moment his own troops reported seeing shells bouncing harmlessly off the enemy armor. The general was forced to take drastic, unconventional measures to save his division from being routed. He personally directed the deployment of a line of 88mm anti-aircraft guns. This improvised use of the Flak-36 proved to be the single most decisive factor in the German response. The high-velocity, high-caliber shells of the 88s finally began to pierce the Matilda's thick armor. Rommel also employed his own Panzer for tanks to harass the British flanks, utilizing their maneuverability. He instructed his crews to fire high-explosive shells, hoping for a crippling hit on the suspension or tracks. The German response was a brilliant example of tactical improvisation under extreme duress and surprise. It demonstrated Rommel's quick thinking and his ability to adapt rapidly to changing battlefield conditions. At one point, the British tanks came perilously close to his own command vehicle. Rommel himself was forced to join the fighting, personally manning an improvised anti-tank gun. This near disaster instilled a profound respect for the Matilda in the future Desert Fox. He later ensured his troops were fully informed on how to correctly engage the heavily armored tanks. The intensity of the fighting at Arras nearly resulted in the capture or death of one of Germany's key commanders. This close call was a serious psychological blow to the German High Command's confidence. It proved that the Allied forces, though battered, still retained the capacity for a deadly counterstroke. The encounter served as a powerful lesson for Rommel about the dangers of overextending his supply lines. He learned a valuable lesson about the importance of securing his flanks during rapid advances. The Battle of Arras, though a tactical defeat for the Allies, triggered a major re-evaluation by the German military. The shock of the Matildas' armor being proof against all their standard weapons was profound and undeniable. The German High Command immediately recognized the serious deficiency in their anti-tank capability. The Pak-36 was now officially deemed obsolete and incapable of dealing with future Allied heavy armor. Plans were rapidly accelerated to introduce new, heavier anti-tank guns into frontline service. The development of the 50mm Pak-38, a more powerful towed anti-tank gun, was prioritized. This new gun would eventually replace the small Pak-36 as the standard anti-tank weapon. More importantly, the engagement at Arras fundamentally influenced German tank design philosophy itself. It confirmed the necessity of increasing the armor protection on the future versions of the Panzer III and IV. Frontal armor was immediately thickened using additional bolt-on plates where possible. The Matilda shock directly contributed to the rapid upgunning of German armored vehicles. The 75mm gun on the Panzer IV was soon given a longer barrel and higher velocity. German engineers learned the hard lesson that speed alone could not guarantee victory against all opponents. They began to place a greater emphasis on the balance between mobility, firepower, and protection. The British tanks forced the Germans to abandon their arrogant assumptions about Allied military weakness. Reports from the 7th Panzer Division were studied meticulously for every detail of the engagement. The effective deployment of the 88mm gun in an anti-tank role was noted. This improvised tactic became a permanent and feared feature of German combined arms warfare. Arras was the moment the Wehrmacht recognized that the tank war was about to become an arms race. The Battle of Arras, despite its dramatic initial success, ultimately could not change the strategic outcome of the campaign. The British force, Operation Frankfurt, was simply too small and too isolated to sustain its deep penetration. The main French counterattack that was planned to support the operation failed to materialize effectively. The Matildas and their supporting infantry were eventually forced to retreat under heavy German pressure. The superior numbers and coordinated artillery fire of the German forces gradually overwhelmed the small attacking force. Many of the precious Matilda II tanks were lost during the disengagement and subsequent withdrawal. The battle ended after approximately 1 day of intense and localized fighting near the town of Arras. In tactical terms, the British had achieved a notable but fleeting victory, stunning the Germans on the flank. They proved that the German advance was not unstoppable and that their tanks were not invulnerable. Crucially, the attack forced Rommel to pause his advance on May 21 and divert significant combat strength. This necessary pause, combined with Hitler's subsequent infamous halt order, bought essential time. The momentary confusion and delay were instrumental in securing the perimeter around Dunkirk. The strategic objective of creating a diversion was therefore ultimately accomplished by the BEF. Thousands of British and French soldiers owed their lives to the brief but brutal counterstroke at Arras. However, the French campaign was already irretrievably lost due to the earlier breakthroughs. The defeat of the Allied armies was a foregone conclusion after the German race to the sea. The success of the evacuation at Dunkirk was the only consolation for the massive continental defeat. Arras stands as a sharp, painful sting that the BEF delivered to the German war machine. The short, intense battle near Arras cemented the Matilda II's reputation as a formidable iron wall. It demonstrated that the emphasis on heavy armor could yield spectacular, if temporary, results. The tank would go on to fight with great distinction in the early phases of the North African campaign. For over a year in the desert, the Matilda II was again essentially immune to all standard German and Italian anti-tank fire. German soldiers in the desert were known to affectionately call the tank the Queen of the Deserts due to its dominance. The lessons learned by the Germans at Arras were slow to be applied in the vast emptiness of North Africa. The Matilda was not finally matched until the introduction of the powerful German 50mm anti-tank guns to the theatre. The tank's design also heavily influenced subsequent British tank development during the war. It proved the concept of the infantry tank, even as the doctrine itself began to slowly fade away. The primary limitation of the Matilda II remained its 2-pounder main gun, which lacked a high explosive capability. This drawback made it difficult to deal with entrenched infantry and soft-skinned targets effectively. As the war progressed, the tank's slow speed and small gun made it increasingly obsolete. New German tanks like the Panther and the Tiger, with their massive guns and sloped armor, quickly surpassed the Matilda. However, the legacy of the tank is forever tied to that single, shocking day in May 1940. The British tank crews proved that courage combined with a massive armor advantage could briefly hold the blitzkrieg. The psychological victory at Arras was invaluable for British morale in the dark days following the French defeat. It was a small light of defiance in the otherwise devastating tide of German conquest. The story of the Matilda is a reminder that technical superiority can occasionally be found in unexpected places. Its sudden, terrifying appearance remains one of the most dramatic moments of the entire 1940 campaign. The laughter of the Panzer crews at the beginning of the campaign was forever silenced by the iron wall at Arras.